There is a particular kind of person who looks at the same world as everyone else and somehow sees something completely different. Not because they have access to information that others don't. Not because they were born with some rare genetic gift that the rest of humanity was denied, but because somewhere along the way they made a decision quietly, almost invisibly, to stop accepting the world as it was handed to them and start questioning everything that everyone else had already agreed to stop questioning. Steve Jobs was that kind of person. And the most important thing you need to understand about him is not what he built, it's how he thought before he built anything at all. Most people, when they hear the name Steve Jobs, immediately think about the iPhone. They think about the black turtleneck, the keynote stages, the one more thing. They think about a man who was somehow touched by genius in a way that ordinary people simply are not. And that story, the story of Jobs as a once-in-a-generation anomaly, is actually the most dangerous story you could ever believe. Because the moment you decide that his way of thinking was something he was born with, you give yourself permission to never think that way yourself. The truth is far more interesting and far more useful than that. Steve Jobs was not a genius in the traditional sense. He was not the best engineer at Apple. He was not the best designer, not the best programmer, not the best businessman in the room. What he was, more than anything else, was the most relentless questioner in any room he ever walked into. He had this almost obsessive inability to accept that the way things were done was the way things had to be done. And that one quality, that single, sustained refusal to inherit the world's assumptions without examining them, is what separated everything he created from everything everyone else was creating at the same time. Here is something worth sitting with for a moment. Every industry, every system, every process you have ever encountered in your life was built on a foundation of assumptions. Someone, at some point in the past, made a decision about how something should work. And then the next person came along and built on top of that decision without questioning it. And then the next person did the same. And after enough time passed, those original decisions stopped looking like decisions at all. They started looking like facts. They started looking like reality itself. And the people working inside those systems stopped asking why things were done a certain way, because the answer had become so obvious it didn't feel like it needed an answer anymore. That's just how it's done. This is the box, not a physical structure, not something you can point to or take a photograph of. The box is simply the accumulated assumptions of the people who came before you, passed down so many times that they've become invisible. And most people spend their entire lives optimizing inside that box, making things slightly better, slightly faster, slightly cheaper, never once stopping to ask whether the box itself needs to exist at all. Jobs stopped to ask that question constantly. It was almost a reflex for him. When he looked at the music industry in the early 2000s, he didn't ask how to make a better CD player. He stripped the entire thing down to its most fundamental truth. People want to listen to the music they love easily, anywhere, anytime. And then he built something from that truth upward, ignoring every assumption the industry had spent decades cementing into place. The result was the iPod and iTunes, which didn't just improve the music industry, it dismantled it and rebuilt it from the ground up. The thinking model behind that kind of breakthrough has a name, and it is worth understanding deeply because it is something you can actually practice. It is called first principles thinking, and it works like this. Instead of looking at a problem and asking how others have solved it, you ask what is actually fundamentally, undeniably true about this situation. You remove every layer of inherited assumption, you strip the problem all the way down to its bones, and then from those bones alone, you build your answer back up. Most people think by analogy, which means they look at what already exists and they copy it, adjust it, improve it at the edges. This is efficient, and for most everyday problems, it works perfectly well. But it will never produce anything truly original because the ceiling of analogical thinking is always the thing that already exists. You can never exceed the original if you're always building from it. First principles thinking has no such ceiling because you're not building from what already exists. You're building from what is true. And what is true is often far more radical, far more open, far more full of possibility than what currently exists. When Jobs applied this kind of thinking to the phone, he didn't ask how to build a better Nokia. He asked what a device that lives in your pocket actually needs to do for a human being. And when he answered that question honestly, without the weight of 30 years of mobile phone industry assumptions pressing down on him, the answer looked nothing like what everyone else was building. It looked like a touchscreen rectangle with almost no buttons. It looked, to most of the industry, like madness, until the day it looked like the future. There is a second dimension to how Jobs thought that is just as important as first principles. And he described it himself in one of the most quietly profound things he ever said. He said that creativity is just connecting things, not inventing from nothing, not summoning ideas from some mystical creative ether, simply connecting things that already exist in the world but have never been placed next to each other before. This sounds almost too simple when you first hear it, but follow the idea a little further and it becomes something extraordinary. If creativity is about connecting things, then the quality and originality of your thinking is directly determined by the diversity of the things you have inside your mind to connect. A person who has only ever consumed ideas from one field, one industry, one type of book, one kind of conversation will only ever be able to make connections within that narrow world. Their thinking will be competent, perhaps even excellent, within its domain. But it will never surprise anyone because the connections it produces are the same connections everyone else in that domain is capable of making. Jobs understood this at a bone-deep level, which is why he spent time studying calligraphy at Reed College, why he traveled to India and sat with Buddhist teachers, why he immersed himself in the design philosophy of Bauhaus architecture and the poetry of Bob Dylan and the precision craftsmanship of a Porsche. None of these things looked like preparation for building a technology company. None of them would have appeared on any sensible business school curriculum as prerequisites for founding Apple. But every single one of them was depositing something into the vast reservoir of his mind, a texture, a principle, a way of seeing that would one day connect with something else entirely and produce an insight that no one who had stayed inside the box of the technology industry could have arrived at alone. The calligraphy classes, for instance, led directly to the multiple typefaces and proportional spacing that made the original Macintosh beautiful in a way that no other personal computer had ever been. That one connection between an art form most engineers would never have studied and the design of a consumer technology product changed the way every computer in the world looked and felt, and it came entirely from a young man who had decided to follow his curiosity into places that made no obvious practical sense. Now here is where this becomes about you and not about Jobs, because everything described so far is a practice, not a personality trait. It is something you do, not something you are. And the reason most people never think this way is not because they are incapable of it, it is because they have never been shown that it is available to them, and because the habits required to think this way are slightly uncomfortable in ways that are easy to avoid. The first habit is the habit of questioning assumptions, and it begins with a single practice you can start today. Pick one thing in your life, a process at work, a belief you hold about your industry, a way you approach a daily problem, and ask yourself honestly, why is this done this way? Not rhetorically, not to be difficult, but with genuine curiosity, as if you were encountering it for the first time and had no prior knowledge of how it was supposed to work. You will find, more often than you expect, that the answer is some version of because that's how it's always been done. And that answer is not a dead end, that answer is a door. Because on the other side of that's how it's always been done is the wide open question of how it could be done differently if you started from truth instead of tradition. The second habit is the habit of feeding your mind from places that have nothing to do with what you do. Read history, study philosophy, learn about fields that seem completely irrelevant to your work or your goals. Not with any specific agenda in mind, not looking for direct applications, but simply collecting dots, accumulating diverse textures and frameworks and ways of seeing that your mind will one day combine in ways you cannot predict and cannot plan for. The connections will come when they are ready. Your only job is to make sure the raw material is there when they do. Raw material is there when. The third habit, and perhaps the most important one, is the habit of sitting with problems long enough to think about them originally. We live in an age where every question has a Google search attached to it, where the reflex to look up the answer has become so automatic that most people never experience the productive discomfort of not knowing. But that discomfort, that space between the question and the answer where your mind has to work without a map, is exactly where original thinking lives. Jobs did not produce his most important ideas by searching for what others had already figured out. He produced them by staying in the question long enough for something new to emerge. In 1985, Steve Jobs was fired from Apple. The company he had built, the company that was the physical embodiment of his vision and his way of thinking, voted him out. And most people faced with that kind of rejection would have concluded that perhaps their way of seeing the world was wrong. Perhaps the box existed for a reason. Perhaps it was time to think more like everyone else. Jobs did not reach that conclusion. He started next. He bought Pixar. He kept thinking the way he had always thought, kept questioning, kept connecting, kept refusing to accept inherited assumptions as final truths. And when he returned to Apple 12 years later, he didn't come back with a safer version of himself. He came back with a deeper one. He came back and built the iMac, the iPod, the iPhone, the iPad, a run of creative output that had no precedent in the history of the technology industry, because he had never once, in all the years of difficulty and rejection, allowed the box to close around him. The box is real. It exists in your industry, in your relationships, in the beliefs you carry about what is possible for someone like you. It was built by people who stopped asking questions, and it is maintained every day by the collective agreement to keep not asking them. But it has never been permanent. It has never been inevitable. It has always been, at its core, just a set of assumptions waiting for someone to question them. The only thing standing between you and that kind of thinking is the decision to start. Not someday, not when you feel ready or qualified or certain enough. Now, today, with the very next problem that lands in front of you. So here is the only question that matters. Are you going to keep optimizing inside the box that someone else built for you, or are you finally going to ask why the box needs to exist at all?